Okay, so today we are going to talk about the story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. So a little background on this story, published in 1973, and just some information. Ursula K. Le Guin is a pretty well-known science fiction writer. She does a lot of tales exploring morality and things of that nature. So that shouldn't be as a surprise after you've read this story. Apparently, she was reading, or this is what I've read, is that she was reading Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and within that novel, there is a question. One character asks another character, if you could be the architect of a utopia, a perfect society, but in exchange for that, one individual would have to live a horrific life, would you create that society? And at the same time, apparently, she was reading the philosopher William James, who was exploring this idea of this utilitarian philosophy. In other words, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that shouldn't be a surprise, again, when you think about what's going on in this story. It's an odd story. It's an odd construction. It doesn't feel anything like The Lottery, even though it does touch on some similar kinds of themes that The Lottery touches on. But it feels very much, it's an allegory. So let me move to my next slide. So it is an allegory. An allegory, if you read my announcement, it's a piece of writing that's very explicitly meant to teach a lesson. So its purpose is to teach a lesson, and usually it's a moral lesson. The Bible has a lot of allegories. Fairy tales are allegorical in nature. You could think of some of those Aesop's fables, if you remember those as a kid. Those are allegories wherein you have a story, something is done in a story form, but its real purpose is to teach some sort of moral lesson. It also falls under this dystopian fiction category that we've been working with the previous two stories. This story does feel similar, again, to The Lottery in a lot of ways. It's the town of Omelas is described as a utopia, a perfect place, but we realize as we read that that's not really the case. So that's kind of falling into this dystopian fiction. And finally, the story is an example of, it's a philosophical story, ultimately. It's a moral dilemma. Maybe at some point you ran across the kind of classic philosophical moral problem story of the trolley problem, it's called, where you have the situation is if you were standing on a train platform with a lever that would divert the train from one track to another, and on the track that the train is on are 5 people who are bound to the train and are going to die. You have within your power, and you know this, and you have within your power to shift the direction of the train to another track by pulling a lever, wherein only one person is going to die. What do? Do you actively pull the lever and shift the train, avoiding 5 people's death, but causing the death of one person? Or do you do nothing and allow 5 people to die by doing nothing, thus saving one person? So that is very, very similar to what Ursula K. Le Guin is asking you to think about with this story. All right. So the five big that I'm asking you to consider are allegory, which we talked about, imagery, which is something we've talked about before too, and it's just this, descriptive words, descriptive language used to give an idea about setting, usually. Juxtaposition is when you have two things set next to each other for some kind of effect. We'll talk about how juxtaposition is used in this story. Ambiguity, where you have an uncertainty and if something is unclear, if it's ambiguous, you don't really know the meaning, you don't really understand. And then finally, scapegoat. And scapegoat's interesting. Scapegoat came up with the lottery with Tessie Hutchinson. And in this case, clearly we have this idea of scapegoat. And if you are familiar, again, with your Christian Bible, often Jesus Christ is seen as a scapegoat figure. So we will talk about all of that. So in terms of setting and character, setting is the town of Omelas, just at the start of a summer festival. We were told that right up front. It's a very descriptive, very imagery-laden first paragraph. Then that whole giant section that follows that first paragraph, where the narrator is involving the reader directly, breaking the fourth wall and saying, addressing the reader, you, if you didn't, if maybe my description of paradise isn't good enough, you think of what you would think. What would you want in your paradise? And all of that can exist in Omelas, which starts to bring up the question of whether, again, with this being allegorical, is this town even real? Or is this some kind of fairy tale that we're getting? So we'll talk a little bit more about setting in the next slide, but I want to mention character. So we don't really have any characters that talk. There's no dialogue, exactly, We have the narrator is the main character in some sense. It's, and the narrator can be a character. Narrator is not named. You want to ask yourself, think about who is this narrator, kind of ponder that. And then we have two individual children that are called out. In the first part, at the very end of the first part, somewhere in, the PDF I gave you, the new PDF, you have the flute-playing boy, which is a really unusual description. It's very odd. And if you note, when you read that description of the boy playing the flute right before the festival is set to open, feels very ritualistic, kind of like the lottery. We have ritual there. And no one speaks to the boy playing the flute. Now, for different reasons than the child in the basement. But that boy playing the flute is about the same age as the child in the basement and is also kind of separate in a sense. So there's that. And then, of course, there's the child in the basement, which, is a real disturbing description. No doubt about it. It's hard to read. It's hard for me to read. But that's intentional by the author. The author intentionally does this, and we'll talk about why that might be. All right. So, importance of the setting. In that first part 1, about the first 2.5 pages, up until the boy with the flute, and then the beginning of the festival, so it's about 2.5 pages in, we have in great minutiae, great detail, very imagery-laden, townspeople, what makes a perfect society, what should be there, what shouldn't be there. There's some discussion about these people not being naive, not being simple folk. You want to ask yourself why that gets mentioned. these people know what's going on. And we find out later why that is, because they know what's going on. They know why they live like they live. That first half feels almost classical Greek or, again, mythical, like a fairy tale. They're going to have a horse parade. You have a lot of people are not ashamed of nudity. People, there's discussion of that, and so none of that. That feels almost like Adam and Eve before the fall, where people are, but in a more fairy tale-like, more classical Greek mythology feels similar. And yet it clearly seems to take place in this day and age, and they have no need for military. They really don't need motorized vehicles. So it's this perfect society, in theory. And the narrator involves the reader. The reader becomes part and parcel of making this description in their head, and that's purposeful. Okay. So then the narrator, in that second half, when we shift to that scene with the child in the basement, wherein everybody in the town, by the time their children are about 10 or 11, about the same age as that child in the basement and that child playing the flute, get brought down to see that situation. So everybody is aware. No one is blissfully ignorant of why they live their perfect life. And there's also a great deal of time and imagery spent on that. That's important because Ursula K. Le Guin wants you as the reader to feel the discomfort that those people feel when those people of Omelas theoretically would feel. It cannot be ambiguous. It has to be uncomfortable. And so that's important that we get those visceral descriptions. The setting is directly involved in the structure of the story. Again, we have the up, Omelas, all the beauty, and we have what's going on underneath. We have what's going on in that cellar. And it's divided almost directly in half, the story. So there's our two parts, which are juxtaposed against one another. We have the top, above ground, and we have below ground. Okay? And then we have two children juxtaposed, each probably, this is my guess, representing some part of society or some part of human nature. Okay? All the good and all the dark. The light and the dark. There's light and there's dark here. So, again, why does the narrator spend so much time? So that the reader cannot be ignorant any more than the townspeople are ignorant. Okay? Then finally, the final little part describes the reaction. So we get a fairly detailed description of the people of Omelas once they're brought to see the child. And we're told a lot about that description, about that contract. So think about that as you're reading. Those who walk away, those who say they cannot take it, those who decide they cannot rationalize the good, with the bad, saying, oh, we're going to rationalize this child being imprisoned down here and this horrific existence because of fill in the blank. So some people walk away. Remember, that's the title of the story, as well as the very last line of the story. Keep that in mind. That's the title of the story and the very last line of the story. The ones who walk away from Omelas. It's a moral dilemma, but it's ambiguous. In other words, we don't really know. We can't. It's Ursula Le Guin, as she writes, this is not clear. We have to make our own decisions. Were they morally superior to walk away? Or were they weak? Or somewhere in between? And what happens to them when they walk away? Because that's also dark and kind of left unclear. It literally discusses the darkness, and that all that description of the town and the cellar, where they walk to, is not well described. It's sort of scantily described. All right. So again, this story is all about considering the morality of the choices people make. And so when you go to write your reading response for this, and you're thinking about those words, and you're thinking about those lines, and remember, your plot summary on this is going to feel a little strange because there feels like there's no real plot. You only want to spend about 3 sentences on the plot, like what actually happens in the story. What you really want to do is pick out your word, which is the most important character. In this case, you really only have 3 to pick from in some ways. Although I guess you could pick all of the townspeople, but you could pick the narrator. You could talk about those 2 children. Then when you pick really what it's about, that's where you're going to get into it. And what do you think the theme is? What is Ursula K. Le Guin trying to say about this? All right, I hope that helps.